Good afternoon, so let's begin. Can you tell us who you are?
My name is Michael Cremo. I'm the author of the book Forbidden Archaeology.
Which I have to say is a personal favourite of mine. I've read cover to cover several times, and so it's a personal great honour to sit down and have a chance to talk to you. How did it come about? What led you into Forbidden Archaeology?
Well, that has to do a lot with the way I was raised. My father was an intelligence officer in the United States Air Force. So that meant a couple of things for me as I was growing up. First of all, it meant I was moving from place to place within the United States and in different countries. And that had the effect of opening my eyes to the reality that there's more than one way of looking at things. The American way is one way, but there are other people with other ways of looking at things. I got exposed to a lot of different cultures as I was growing up. When I was a teenager, I was living in Europe. Once I went to Stockholm on a vacation. I was staying in a youth hostel there, and I met some young people who'd gone overland to India and back, and they were telling me some pretty interesting things about India, so I decided I'd like to do that as well. And gradually I became interested in studying the ancient Sanskrit writings of India. And in those writings I encountered descriptions of human populations existing on Earth millions of years ago. That was something completely different than I'd ever heard from my teachers in high school and university.
Mm-hmm.
So I began to wonder about these statements in these ancient writings, not just the ancient Sanskrit writings of India, but many different ancient wisdom traditions speak of humans existing a long time ago, much further back in time than current theories would allow. I wondered, are those statements just mythological inventions, or is there perhaps some factual basis for them in science? That's what got me looking into the whole history of archaeology. Of course, when I looked in the current textbooks of archaeology, I didn't see any evidence for extreme human antiquity. I only saw evidence that supported the current theories, namely that humans like us first came into existence less than 200,000 years ago, having evolved from more primitive ape-like human ancestors. But I decided to look beyond the textbooks. I wanted to look at the original scientific reports published in the professional scientific literature. When I started doing that, I began finding many reports of archaeologists finding human bones, human artifacts, human footprints, many millions of years old, much older than the 200,000 years that most scientists now accept for a modern human presence
Absolutely, yeah.
on Earth. So that's what got me looking into this whole topic. So I collected those reports and put them in the book Forbidden Archaeology, and since then I've been pursuing that line of research.
And what would you say is the first anomalous artifact that you encountered personally that really started to cement the theory into something really quite tangible?
Well, I had a suspicion, that such evidence was there. I just thought it might be there. So I had a research assistant, and I asked him to start looking into textbooks of archaeology from the 19th century, not the current textbooks. And I was right. When you go back to those older books, they mention some unusual discoveries that are no longer mentioned in the textbooks today. I think the first one that really caught my attention was the California gold mine discoveries. In the 19th century, gold was discovered in California. Miners went there to get it. They dug tunnels into the sides of mountains. And deep inside those tunnels in the solid rock, the miners were finding human bones and human artifacts, not at just one location, but many different locations in the gold mining region. And these human bones and human artifacts were found in layers of rock that modern geologists tell us are about 50 million years old. So the state geologist of California, Dr. J.D. Whitney, collected all these discoveries and wrote a report about them that was published by Harvard University in the year 1880. And we don't see these things mentioned in the textbooks today, but they were very serious discoveries made by a professional scientist, reported in a scientific publication. And I studied his publication very carefully, and I would notice here and there he would mention in footnotes, and objects of similar age were found in Europe by Dr. Carlos Ribeiro in Portugal. So then I would track down Dr. Ribeiro's report. And these things are not mentioned in the textbooks today. You have to go through quite a bit of research to track these things down.
And how easy did you find it to actually find them?
Well, I had a research assistant who's very good at tracking things down. A lot of this stuff isn't available on the web. Certainly when I started this research in 1984, a lot of this stuff there wasn't even a World Wide Web at that point.
Quite.
And even today, much of this stuff, it's only accessible by tracking it down through libraries, getting out of print documents from archives and things like that. So I tracked down Ribeiro's reports, and he had discovered human artifacts 20 million years old in Portugal and published them in the scientific literature. Of course, it was in Portuguese. Now, because of my educational background, I have a reading knowledge of most of the major European languages.
Wow.
So I'm able to read archaeological reports in Portuguese, French, German, Italian, and so on. So I tracked down his reports, and then in little footnotes he would mention, and this researcher in France, the Abbé Bourgeois, he made discoveries in Miocene formations 20 million years old in France. So then I would go and track those down in the French, and that would lead me to other discoveries. At first, I thought I was going to do about 8 weeks of research, maybe write a short little pamphlet, and then go on to some other topic. But one discovery kept leading to another, so the 8 weeks turned into 8 months, and the 8 months turned into 8 years. By the time I'd done 8 years of research, I think I had pretty much covered the field, in a general way at least. And it was at that time that I put out, the book Forbidden Archaeology. So after that 8 years of research, I felt I pretty much covered the field, at least for a first go-over. So it was at that time that I brought out the book Forbidden Archaeology, which was a collection of all of these reports of archaeological evidence for extreme human antiquity.
And what was your intention for it at the time? Was it simply to bring to public attention, or did you intend to present your work to academics? What was the reaction of the academic world?
Well, I had a lot of different audiences in mind when I was putting this research together. One audience I had in mind was the academic and scientific audience, and then the other audience I had in mind was the general public. So actually I had a whole strategy in mind. I thought, okay, I'm going to put out this book, Forbidden Archaeology, which is very well documented. It's written with an academic audience in mind. So my plan was to send it out for review in the professional academic journals of archaeology and anthropology, knowing that it was going to be quite controversial. And basically there were three reactions among scientists. Some hated it, some grudgingly admitted that there's some value to what I was doing, and third reaction is silence. So those were the three basic reactions.
So not favourably received then, particularly.
Well, just grudging acknowledgement that there's something to be learned from what I did, I think, is positive in a way. Some just dismissed it. Said, Richard Leakey, for example, said, this is pure humbug. Nobody would take it seriously but a fool. But other archaeologists, like archaeologist Tim Murray, wrote in his review of Forbidden Archaeology in British Journal for History of Science that he was sure that there were researchers who would profit by reading this book because it presents in detail so many case studies of archaeological evidence that can be used to analyze the epistemology of archaeology. Epistemology is the science of how do we know things, what do we know, and how do we know it. So I thought that was quite a positive reaction. But the negative reactions were also there. So I had a strategy in mind that then, after the book was released, that 900-page book, Forbidden Archaeology, was released to the scientific community, and they had given their reactions, then I would release a shorter edition of the book, about 300 pages long, called The Hidden History of the Human Race, to the general public. And I would use all the positive and negative statements that had come from the scientific reviews to get some attention from the media. And actually that worked. I got many radio and television interviews, and because the book just attracted the attention of people in the media, especially the negative statements. They'd never seen anybody put the negative reviews on their book, as well as the positive ones. So then that shorter edition of the book was translated into about 20 different languages: French, Italian, Spanish, Russian, Bulgarian, Hungarian, Japanese, about 20 different languages. And I got invitations from all over the world to do author tours in these different countries, and I was able to communicate with the general public through newspapers, radio, television, so on and so forth. So, yeah, I did have a plan in mind when I was writing the book. I wanted it to influence the scientific world, and I also wanted it to influence the general public. And the reason I wanted to do that is because I think our concept of who we are and where we come from affects our lives in this world in a major way.
Absolutely.
How we define our identity will determine what kinds of goals that we set for ourselves, what types of values we adopt. So the questions, who am I, where did I come from, are very important. Now, for the past century or so, the supporters of the current theories of human origins have had a government-enforced monopoly in the education systems in most countries, and therefore they've been able to dictate the answers to these very important questions. Who am I? Where did I come from? Well, you're an evolved ape. You're a machine made of molecules. In other words, they give very, very materialistic answers to these fundamental questions. Who am I? Where did I come from? As a famous English scientist says, Richard Dawkins, as he says, we are survival machines. We are robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes. That's what you are. You're a machine. You're a selfish machine made of molecules in competition with other machines made of molecules to control material resources and things like that. I think those kinds of answers to the questions, who am I and where did I come from, are at the root of a lot of the problems that our world faces today. I think attitudes like that are at the root of our environmental crisis, the main cause of which is overproduction and overconsumption of more and more material things.
Indeed.
I think such answers as are given by modern science are also at the root of our financial crisis.
But it is chasing an intrinsically materialistic paradigm, isn't it? The
Right.
pursuit of ever greater growth and ever greater profit.
Right. And some people, and you're in competition with everyone else in the financial system. So if you can take unfair advantage of others in that whole process, why not? It's dog eat dog, survival of the fittest. And some people do, and therefore, they game the system in ways that are putting others in a very bad position.
So would you say that then that your work has been contributory to challenging that control paradigm?
Yes, absolutely. I'm suggesting another answer to these fundamental questions: who am I, where did I come from? After people read my book, Forbidden Archaeology, which contains archaeological evidence that contradicts the current theories of human origins and identity, they asked, okay, you have all this evidence, archaeological evidence, that contradicts the theory that we evolved by some blind evolutionary process from primitive apes and monkeys. So after people read my book, Forbidden Archaeology, they asked me a question. They said, you've got all this archaeological evidence that contradicts the current theories of human origins. So if you don't think that we evolved from primitive apes and monkeys, then where do you think we came from? So to answer that question, I wrote a book called Human Devolution, in which I present an alternative to the current theories of human origins. It's a consciousness-based alternative. I propose that before we even ask the question, where did human beings come from, we should first of all ask the question, what is a human being? And many scientists today are going to give a very materialistic answer to that question. They'll simply say, well, we're machines made of molecules, and as far as consciousness is concerned, if you organize the molecules in the brain in a sufficiently complex way, they'll generate consciousness, but only temporarily and only in association with the brain. And when, at the time of death, the molecules in the brain become disorganized, there's no more consciousness, nothing like that. So it's a very matter-based picture of reality. But I'm proposing something quite different. I'm proposing that consciousness can exist independent of matter.
Yeah.
Matter does not produce consciousness, but consciousness can become associated with matter. I'm proposing that originally we are beings of pure consciousness, and under certain states of consciousness, consciousness can become associated with matter. That's what I call devolution. As conscious beings, we don't evolve up from matter, as most scientists now believe. Rather, we devolve or come down from pure consciousness. And the real purpose of human life is not to try to dominate, control, and exploit matter to the maximum extent possible, but is instead to restore consciousness to its original pure state. So if we have that understanding, I am a being of pure consciousness, then we'll try to satisfy our material necessities in the most simple, natural, and efficient way possible. And that'll be good for the environment. Also, if we have this understanding that I'm a being of pure consciousness, all others are beings of pure consciousness, we're all related to each other on that level of pure consciousness, then we won't be dividing ourselves into competing groups as under the current theory, which tells us we're machines made of matter in competition with each other for survival.
The illusion of separation, in fact.
Yes. We'll be finding ways to cooperate with each other and understand each other. So I think these questions, who am I, where did I come from, are very important. They're not just some questions for a few scientists and philosophers to argue about in their ivory towers. They affect the lives of each of us.
Let me ask you just for a second about how the gifted amateur, if you like, as opposed to the career academic or the career scientist, contributes to the sum total of human knowledge. And by that I mean, when we venture out and start asking questions and look empirically for the answers to those questions, how much more valid or how much more latitude does the amateur have not having their paycheck funded by an academy that insists on maintaining that paradigm?
Well, we have to consider, for example, Charles Darwin even. You know, he wasn't a professional scientist. He was a gentleman scholar, and he had some impact. Of course, after his time, the sciences did become more and more professionalized. Darwin wasn't working for a paycheck. You know, he was an English gentleman. He had his source of income, and he did his scientific work out of love for it. So after his time, it became more a matter of getting a paycheck. And when you have a system that's based totally on that, then it becomes a matter of doing what you need to do in order to have a position, have a paycheck. Now, one problem with science as it is today, it's just become very monolithic. In other words, science has become identified with one particular metaphysical outlook, the materialistic, reductionistic outlook. And no other outlooks are tolerated within science. So those who are exploring these alternative worldviews in terms of science have to do it outside, you know, the professional circles. Now, one thing that could change that is if science would accept metaphysical pluralism. Actually, at the time of Darwin, European science did have metaphysical pluralism. There were scientists working according to different worldviews and understandings. There were scientists like Richard Owen, for example, who was a contemporary of Darwin. He was trying to understand biology in terms of a Platonic metaphysics. He had an idea there were Platonic forms of animals that existed on some higher level of reality that were being reflected into the world of matter. There were...
Which, of course, is not so very far from quantum theory.
No.
As we would view it today.
And then there were other scientists who were operating according to a Judeo-Christian metaphysics. They were promoting a doctrine called special creation, the idea that God in the beginning created each, you know, separate species, And that was actually the mainstream view in the universities at that time, that Darwin was reacting against as an outsider.
And yet, of course, ironically, Darwin himself was a passionate Christian, which has always struck me as somewhat ironic.
Yeah. There were other scientists in Europe and Germany. They were called Naturphilosophs. They were operating according to the idea there are subtle, vital principles in living things that explain the forms, that they take. Then Darwin, he was operating according to a more strictly mechanistic and materialistic metaphysics, trying to explain how everything could be accounted for by random variations that were acted upon by natural selection. So at that time, science in the West, in Europe, was functioning with different scientists operating according to different metaphysical outlooks. So today, that's no longer true. There's a kind of a dictatorship now of the materialist, and they enforce it very strictly in the scientific world and in the education systems. And I think that's something that needs to be broken. We shouldn't allow one group of scientists to hijack the whole system and get a monopoly in the education system and in the scientific institutions. Normally, in countries that regard themselves as free and democratic, we don't tolerate, say, the government saying you can only belong to one political party, or you can only read one newspaper, or only belong to one church or religion, or only watch one television station. Normally we don't tolerate that. But at the present moment, many governments are saying you can only learn one type of science, materialistic, reductionistic science. And this is true even though there are scientists who are proposing different alternatives based on different metaphysical worldviews. For example, there's, here in England, Rupert Sheldrake, who talks about morphogenetic fields. It's a Platonic or Aristotelian idea. I'm talking about consciousness existing separately from matter. That's not a very popular idea today in science. So what I say is there should be metaphysical pluralism in science in the education system. In the textbooks, it should be stated, for example, okay, most scientists now accept the Darwinian theory of human evolution, which is based on a strictly materialist metaphysics, but there are other scientists and researchers who are proposing other ideas, and here's what they are, and then just let students make up their own minds.
Which I would agree wholeheartedly with that. The concept of encouraging independent thought is only to be applauded. We're here at the annual Megalithomania conference in Glastonbury, in the heart of ancient Avalon, and I wanted to touch just a little bit on some of the fundamentals of what brings me here, and indeed many of the people who come to this. And one of the prime questions of that is, what were the ancients up to? What were they doing? And if we look, for instance, I mean, iconically speaking, Stonehenge is probably the single most potent image globally of Neolithic and indeed prehistoric culture in Europe, shall we say. I'll come to when in a moment. Why do you think it was built?
Well, I'm going to say that the Neolithic is not my main period of research. Alternative history is a big topic. Some researchers specialize in, say, Egyptian types of questions. Others look at megaliths from the Neolithic period. I look at extreme human antiquity. That's my main topic. However, I am interested in these other aspects of archaeology, but I'll have to say that I'm approaching them as a lay person. In other words, my main field of research isn't Stonehenge. I'm going to visit it today, taking part in a tour that's part of the Megalithomania event, and I'm expecting to learn some things about Stonehenge from what I can understand, from my layman's point of view, is that Stonehenge is set up in such a way that there are alignments to different astronomical events, solstice points, equinox points, alignments to certain celestial bodies. So I think that is one aspect of it, that the ancients were very much aware that our Earth has many subtle connections with the celestial bodies that are visible in the sky. And it is not something I can directly, prove about the people that made Stonehenge, but it's something that to me seems intuitively very likely, is they understood that as conscious beings we are influenced by celestial events, and that we may even have connections with other conscious beings who inhabit, these celestial regions. They may even be a destination for us. So I think they were aware of all these things. It's not something that I can definitely prove, but to me it's something that seems very likely. So I've read some interesting studies lately about the sonic properties of Stonehenge.
Archaeoacoustics.
Yes,
I believe. Yeah.
archaeoacoustics. And it's not always easy to do experiments right there at Stonehenge, but some scientists have pointed out that in the United States, in Washington State, there's a park where some group has put up an exact replica of the complete Stonehenge as it would have looked when it was originally constructed. And they've been able to do these archaeosonic experiments there. And they're pretty amazing. I think there is, among ancient people, there was a great deal of attention given to sound vibration, the power of sound vibration.
Absolutely. But Paul Devereux has done a lot of good work in this area. And I'm reminded, I spent some time myself a few years ago in the Yucatan, in Chichen Itza. Shows remarkable acoustic properties in that you can speak across what they call the ball court and whisper from one structure to another and hear as though somebody's speaking right in your ear. So absolutely, yes, I think the ancients did have a far more developed understanding of acoustics than we give them credit for, certainly.
Right. So, as I said, those are some things that as a layman I've come to understand about, Stonehenge, and I'm looking to increase the depth of my knowledge by visiting there today and hearing some of the things that are going to be presented here at the Megalithomania 2012.
I want to round up a little bit now, but just talking about some of the other ancient sites and come very much to the when we look at sites like Stonehenge, like Giza, obviously, like Tiwanaku, in Bolivia, like the Chinese pyramids, the Great White Pyramid, Uxmal in the Yucatan. Do you think that we are seeing the legacy of different and independent cultures or do you see traces of a unified parent culture?
Well, I think both things can be there. There can be separate cultures with their own particular roots, but there can also be communication among them. We see it today that maybe in a certain country a technology is invented, then it spreads to other countries, other people. It's something that we observe today, and I think in the past this was also true. I don't think these cultures were always, in all cases, isolated from the other cultures that were existing contemporaneously in the world. It looks like there were signs of communication among them. You can see many parallels in their cosmologies and their architecture. For example, the prevalence of pyramid-like structures in different parts of the world, Egypt, China, South America, the Indochina Peninsula. They have very similar structures. And they also have similar cosmologies. In my book, Human Devolution, I did a cross-cultural study of cosmologies. I selected about 30 world cultures widely separated in time and space. And I saw they all had common features. For example, they had the idea that we exist in a multi-level cosmos and that the different levels are inhabited by different types of beings, perhaps of a more subtle nature than exist on our terrestrial level. That was a very common idea among all of them. They also had the idea that there's something more to a human being than matter, that there is some human essence, you could call it a soul, that can exist apart from matter. There's a subtle mental body with unusual powers. Some might call them paranormal powers, like extrasensory perception, mystic powers, yogic powers, things of that sort. These are common features of all of these different cultures. And I think there may be a couple of different reasons for the similarities. One is that they were in contact with each other on the terrestrial level. That's one possibility, and I think there's some evidence for that. But another possibility is that these cultures in their different locations were all accessing the same higher reality, from their specific positions. But because they're accessing the same reality, then their cosmologies are going to have similarities. It's as if, say, you have some people looking at a mountain from different angles of vision, some looking from the north, some from the south, the east, the west. Their descriptions of the mountain are going to be a little bit different because they're looking at it from different angles, but it's still going to be obvious that they're talking about the same thing. So I think that can be a primary cause of the similarities in these different cultures, that they're all accessing from their different geographical locations the same higher reality.
Michael Cremo, thank you very much. Have a cup.